All right, I'm going to call to order the October 15th work session of the Eugene Water and Electric Board. I'm going to go through the safety and awareness briefing briefly. I'm going to leave some things out that aren't relevant since we don't have a big group here. I just want to note that public testimony is not taking place this evening because it's a work session. This format is not set up for public testimony. Visitor access is limited to the board meeting room and restrooms. Restrooms are located on the first floor. And people can go through the interior or at the back of the room, and a security officer will direct you to the location. For all of us, in the event of emergency, such as a fire or security incident, please follow instructions given by staff. Something else I was gonna, just want to note that Commissioner Brown is not joining us this evening. So down one individual. With that, I think I'll turn it over to the general manager.
President McCray, and thank you, commissioners. Good evening. We rearranged the schedule slightly from the last board meeting, considering that the two topics this evening that are really open for discussion around the BPA product choice then leads itself into a little bit of a broader discussion. So we, rather than start with the business model, we switched that up, and we're going to start a little bit with Bonneville, and then we'll extrapolate from that into some larger discussions. But with that, I will turn it over to Brian Booth, who you all know is our Chief Energy Resources Officer, and his team. And I'm just going to duck out for a second. So,
you know the one.
No. Oh yeah, never mind.
All right, Mike should be on. Hi everyone. Frank already gave me the introduction. From my left on over, I have Aaron Bush, Senior Analyst in our Energy Division. Next to him, Ben Ulrich, Lead Analyst. And in the far corner, Aaron Orlowski, Communications Guru. Sure. Expert. Thank you for joining us. This is going to be a fun conversation. There we go. We're here to talk about qualitative considerations that are going into the energy resource stuff. This is going to be a little different than some of the discussions we've had in the past. I love numbers. This team loves numbers. There's not a lot of numbers in this one. It's fuzzy because qualitative factors aren't fuzzy. Agenda. So our agenda for tonight, we're going to take a look at the timeline of this process, where we're at, where we're going. Aaron's going to have that. Aaron O is going to have an update the community table. We had it Friday before last. Yeah, get you some reactions on that, or I should say, get you an update of that so you can have reactions. Then we'll be talking about our values, key factors, and our relationship with the product choice. So the timeline, here's where we're at. It is October. We are here for the qualitative consideration work session. We're going to be back in December with initial results, initial quantitative results, I should say. So numbers, which are much more satisfying. And we hope to have board endorsement of a decision next spring. So that way we can sign a new contract at the end of next year. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Aaron O, who can talk about the community table.
All right. Well, thank you, Brian, and good evening, commissioners. As Brian mentioned, we had the first session of the community table on October 4. But just as a reminder of what the community table is, this is a group of representatives from different community organizations that we invited to join us to examine some of these energy supply decisions together. And the point was to invite people who, are from organizations that represent certain segments of the community, who do this as part of their day jobs. And that way we can uncover the broad cross section or the broad spectrum of views that might be inherent in this set of choices. We're not necessarily looking for consensus, and we probably won't get it. But that's fine. We're looking for what the ends of the spectrum are. So who did we invite and who showed up? For this particular iteration, we got local institutions, the city, the county, environmental groups, industrial and large customers, and then folks from different housing organizations. And what did we do? We presented some information to them, and then the bulk of it was really small group discussion led by different members of the energy team here to really suss out what some of the insights were. We collected lots of feedback. That is the stack of paperwork on my desk. So this chart did have numbers on it at one point, but per what Brian said, we're trying to eliminate all quantitative elements from this presentation. So what we did is we asked participants to fill out this chart and to say whether we should decrease, maintain, or increase focus on these 5 different values that pertain to energy supply decisions. And the key lesson here is that our community wants us to do more of pretty much everything. And having a person say that we should do less of a particular thing was quite rare. So that just means that the trade-offs and the difficult discussions are left to you all. And then we moved on to the small group discussion, and we asked 5 different questions. These are the paraphrased questions that we asked them, and kind of a key takeaway from each. I'm not going to read through it necessarily, but basically we learned all values matter, all the 5 different values that we asked them about, but some matter more to certain people than to others. So for instance, reliable and affordable power was very important to some of our business and large customers, industrial users. Some of our environmental group friends were okay with sacrificing some of that reliability. So that's just an instance of where there's different views on this topic. And sometimes there's tension. We did stay away from talking about the BPA decision in detail. This was a discussion about values. We kept it very high level. But when we did touch on the BPA decision, there actually was a fair bit of consensus in this group to keep that local based on the information they have at this time. So that was a really interesting finding. Of course, that could change as we share more information with them. And then unsurprisingly, this group also wanted to be active in the decision-making process, which makes sense. They came to a meeting, they showed up, and that was kind of to be expected. And it's also part of our identity as a public utility. So the next session is planned for early December, and we're hoping to get some initial commentary from you all, just some kind of feedback, high level. You'll get a more detailed rundown of the feedback from the session in a memo later. But at this point, what are some of your initial reactions to this community feedback? President McCray.
I'll just open it up, Mindy. Yeah.
My initial reactions are the feedback you got is not surprising because you asked a wide group of individuals what they wanted, and everybody wants what they want. So not surprising at all. I think the thing that maybe gives me the most pause is how much, what happens with this feedback? I guess sometimes I worry a little bit about when we open up public process and we invite the public to participate, that we're not really asking them to participate. Because there's a lot of trade-offs and decisions that we have to make, and we're the ones that are making the decisions. And so sometimes it feels a little bit performative, and that we kind of lead people to believe that they have more input than they really will. I think that public participation needs to be really meaningful, and oftentimes it's not. I'm not saying that this isn't, but that's just my hesitation. Especially given that the feedback that we got is that everybody wants everything. So like that just can't happen. So some people are going to feel like, hey, EWEB didn't listen to me. They only listened to these people, or maybe many people will think EWEB didn't listen to me because we're going to have to make trade-offs everywhere. So I think that it's admirable that we reach out and we want to hear what people have to say, but I just worry a little bit about expectations. Go for it.
I want to hear first.
Okay, well, I'm also not super surprised by the reactions. I think it would be helpful to have, something to the effect of, the exercise that we once did around, okay, you have 9 chips. Where do you put those chips instead of just saying, you know, see, they have limited resources that they then have to dole out, because that is the question that we're facing. We have limited resources. If you care about affordability, we're not expanding those resources, we're keeping that pot the same. So where are the things that are going to give? I also share some of the same concerns that Mindy had around how we get the feedback and what we do with it and the message that we convey to them and what is next. So I would like to hear more about kind of what the messaging was about how they're involved moving forward. We do want their feedback. It is valuable if we ask the right questions, but I also want to make sure that we're not leading them down something that isn't what we're going to do. Very simple. And it doesn't feel like there's too much to give a lot of feedback on. So I guess that's also where I'm at.
Yeah, more to come in a future memo. To answer your question, the messaging was specifically that we would deliver the feedback to you all. And that was the extent of the promise.
Don?
Yeah, I think Mindy really hit it on the head as far as her comments go. And I too am leery of the open-ended, what do you want? Because nobody says, oh, I want more expensive power. Nobody's gonna say that. Nobody's gonna say, I don't care if the power goes off in January. They all want, everybody wants everything, and we can't give everybody everything. And then again, you're asking for feedback from us, but the amount of input that we got was not even on a bubblegum wrapper as far as the information to give feedback on. I don't know who you say community people. I don't know who they were. I don't know how many of them there were. I don't know, you say our bigger customers, okay. Percentage of, getting to your numbers, percentage of our income. Is it, if 2 of those people have are huge drivers in our economic plate, and other ones are representing smaller niche interest groups, that weighs into my decision as well. So I think what Mindy said categorizes what I have, and then the second part is I would have liked to have seen the memo before this meeting rather than post meeting.
I'll just take one quick moment and say, I shared the thoughts. I'm interested in who the representation was, like by organization or industry that they were representing. I don't know if they participated on the condition of anonymity. I don't need to know names necessarily, but affiliation would be helpful to form my thinking. I'm crushed without numbers. I don't know what to do with it. I'm lost. And my last question, did we pay any attendees to participate? I'm just wondering, okay. I do think, to the extent that we're trying to capture as many as possible, I think paying some folks who might otherwise not be able to afford to attend could be valuable for that.
I didn't say one thing. I'm also interested in who didn't attend. So you said that you invited 25 people and only 14 attended. So I'm curious when we get that information, who did.
That will be in the memo. Generally speaking, the folks who were representing their organizations in a professional manner were more likely to attend than those who act on a volunteer basis. For business folks who were there on the clock, I would hypothesize that they were more able to go to an 8 a.m. workday meeting than folks who do volunteering in their spare time.
I'll just jump in that your comments are not surprising. We really wrestled with wanting to tell you we did this thing, and we hadn't summarized the results yet, but we're like, we're having this working session. We need to tell them we had our first community table. So I definitely hear that feedback, and I would have liked the memo to have been done prior to this, but we were like, let's at least rush and try and tell them what we can
right away and follow up with a memo. So I want to get that cadence better next time because I think it will help the conversation be more fruitful. And we are going to do more community table. So after you get those memos, maybe some feedback I think would be helpful for us after you digest. That'll help inspire us for future community tables. How do we make it more useful? How do we start the education process about the trade-offs? And we've asked the community table members to tune into our meeting tonight because we're all learning about the context of this PPA product decision together. And so it's kind of an invitation to tune in and letting them know that this higher level conversation is taking place. So that was kind of our anxiety, to just get this conversation started so that we could keep having it over the course of, by June 2025 when we make this decision.
Great, thanks. I personally appreciate bringing stuff, even if it's not fully banked. I think it's helpful just to help us think. Thank you, Frank.
Yeah, I really appreciate the comments. I think one of the things that we do recognize that this board is where we get our guidance. I think also in our approach to outreach and just understanding and studying things, we want to test the boundaries with certain groups and certain people to make sure that there's something that we're not missing, but we're not leaning into that group to make any kind of decision for this board. We want to be as informed as we can, not just where we find consensus, which is we want more of everything, but also at some point, what might those trade-offs and the sort of the range of outcomes be? The timing aside, which Ben touched on, we do really consider this board as our governing body and where we're going to get our guidance from. So that's in that, though, one of the things that we have to be careful of is whenever you ask for somebody's opinion, they're going to go, well, why do you want it? What are you going to use it for? And we need to make sure that we're very clear with people that this is to test some of our assumptions. This is for things that we're looking to check out. It's not necessarily designed to influence a specific decision. I think we have to be clear with that.
I know we were on a bit of a time
Yep.
crunch. I do want to point out that an interesting thing that came be from the community table wasn't so much that everybody wanted everything. It was some of the things they didn't necessarily ask for. We go back to our scores, though they're all pretty similar. They're not exactly the same. We did not hear a lot of folks say, you know what, do less and just focus on affordability. If you look at the scores there, affordability is the least high of them. Nobody was willing to, mark that a 1 or a 2. But we definitely heard a lot of folks say, hey, we want you to do this stuff. And there was some acceptance that it cost money.
Well, and that could also be reflective of the 14 people who were there.
Absolutely.
Potentially afford it, not are living paycheck to paycheck.
Yes.
Even though they weren't in that room, they're definitely part of who I watch out for.
Getting to Matt's point about underrepresented people their voices being heard. I was part of a planning process when I was on the planning commission for, I don't know if it was River Road or one of the areas. And we used a firm, I think it was called Democracy Now! Or whatever, where they picked people out of a hat, basically at random. And then they offered them financing so that they could do childcare and a nominal stipend. So it was enough so that somebody could take the day off of work if they were working, or if they were at home and had kids, they could afford to get their childcare. So maybe that's something we could look into pulling from our ratepayers, one person from each ward, pull them out, make some offers. I don't know if that's something, but that was something that it gave us some good insight, because a lot of times what I've seen in public processes, you get the same people showing up at the table and you hear the same thing over and over again. And this brought fresh eyes and people that didn't have a specific agenda other than the fact that they're getting an EWEB bill.
All right. Any other discussion? So I think you're going for something there.
No, I was hoping
We'll get into some more weeds now. So the goal tonight is to have allow the commissioners to have a discussion about some of the trade-offs and some of the qualitative differences between the BPA products. And so I'm going to try and do a little bit of table setting here to get the conversation started before I have Aaron walk it through in more detail. But I want to give you the spoiler alert here is that we are choosing from among good options. So all of the BPA product options, EWEB can meet our goals and our values. And really this is about how EWEB goes about meeting our goals and our values is where this product choice is going to make an influence. So we did some brainstorming with the executive steering committee. And we tried to brainstorm where are the qualitative differences among products so we can highlight those differences and give you a sense of real world trade-offs in these products. And we came up with 5 key factors that we identified in our brainstorming. We're going to walk you through them tonight. It's flexibility, portfolio cost risk, local control, local resource development, and EWEB programs and incentives. And the key here is that the BPA product choice impacts how we get to our goals. So saying the same thing, but in a slightly different way, the BPA product choice creates a future decision-making environment because it's the foundation of our portfolio, and BPA rates and BPA policies are going to influence our future decision-making and our future strategy. So at a high level, planned product utilities, so EWEB is a planned product customer today, we have more of a do-it-yourself approach to our portfolio management in exchange for less BPA influence. So the idea there is you've got some different bubbles that feed into our portfolio, like our programs like energy efficiency and demand response, how we manage our owned assets like Carmen Smith, the amount of contracted resources that we buy to supplement our Bonneville product, the amount of market interaction we have in energy markets or our risk management. Those are all aspects that feed into our portfolio. And Bonneville has very little influence over that today. We're more of a do-it-yourself approach. Load following utilities have a different strategy. They tolerate a few more requirements and constraints on how they manage their own assets, for example. And they tolerate those constraints in exchange for allowing BPA to manage more aspects of their portfolio on their behalf as part of a larger pool. So it's kind of just a different strategy. And if you allow BPA to manage more on your behalf, that could reduce your need to do it yourself. And so as we start to have this conversation today about what kind of EWEB, what kind of utility EWEB might want to be in the future, and Aaron's going to give some real world trade-off examples here, I just want to prompt the commissioners to start thinking, do I think EWEB should be more of a do-it-yourself utility, or do I see benefits in doing a pooling approach and allowing BPA to do more on our behalf? And we're doing that without the context of numbers. So this is just conceptual. We're not making a decision today. It's just more to just facilitate a conversation without numbers. Do I have some leanings or trade-offs that I want to think about, or do I react to some of these trade-offs differently? So I'm going to pass it to Aaron, and he's going to walk through some of these key factors and trade-offs between the BPA product choices.
All right. So yeah, thanks. That summary was really helpful, just the overall context. I'm going to try and walk through those kind of 5 key factors. There's also a few kind of informational slides in here. And the goal is to kind of set up this for discussion with you. So I'm going to try and broadly say like what it is, so define it, how it might be different across the products, and then maybe why it's important or why we might care about it. So in general, just starting off, you heard with the community table, local control is something they might care about. In general, we find that planned products, so we've said that word a few times, it basically encompasses everything except for load following. For right now, we're kind of simplifying. And so that's like slice block, block by itself, and block with shaping. All of these products kind of lumping into planned products. And so defining local control is the ability for EWEB to affect change to our portfolio ourselves, right? And so planned products, as we go through this discussion, you'll see in general with those, we'll have more needs for resource procurement, more needs to do portfolio management, and also more needs to kind of manage our own reserves ourselves. So it's just EWEB just does more with those products. For load following, Bonneville takes on a lot more of those responsibilities, and there's less need for EWEB to do it ourselves. And so at the end of the day, their Bonneville rates and policy, you're going to have more of an influence over EWEB at the end of the day if we went that direction. And so at a high level here, we're assuming broadly that all of these options are going to get us to our goals. Does it matter to the board that would say, hey, we're in a boat and that boat is going this direction. We don't need to be steering the rudder. Or it's like, no, it matters to us in our community to have our hand on the rudder and say how we're getting there. So that's the kind of broadest category of local control to begin with. One of the other key factors that we identified is flexibility. So broadly defining that as our ability to change direction in the future, given new information, right? So we know we're heading towards more uncertain times. Might we want to be able to pivot, and what does that look like? I do want to call out this yellow box here. Flexibility, there's some pieces tied to the product itself that kind of put constraints on certain products that have attributes to them. But also our future flexibility is a result of decisions that we make subsequent to the product, right? Ben talked about creating this environment. So decisions that we make about the resources that we have or the staffing, the capabilities that we have are going to impact our ability to change course in the future. So there's flexibility directly from the product, but also subsequent decisions. In general, again, we're finding that plan products, because we tend to own more of the portfolio management and we have more resource flexibility, they tend to allow for more flexibility. Load following with Bonneville managing the portfolio, there's less incentive for EWEB to do it ourselves because we don't need to. And that might, right, kind of disincentivizes kind of the capabilities and knowledge in EWEB because we no longer need to do it. We might lose that and it might change our flexibility in the future. So moving to cost risk. So this is just looking at within year cost risk for a portfolio, right? So if you assume that each year you're serving load and the load varies and the costs for market prices or to serve that load is varying, or you have a different hydro year, how much cost variation is there? And in general, slice block has the most, and that's because EWEB sees both the variability on our load side, its cost of serving that load, and on the hydro side. But if you look at the top line here, well, that specific product, we directly see it. The hydro variability across the products is actually similar, and that's because it's the underlying federal system is serving is that resource. And so it's really about whether EWEB or Bonneville is managing that. So if you look at the plan products, that's EWEB, we have reserves policies, we have a risk management committee, we have a lot of portfolio hedging and balancing activities that we take on. We manage it ourselves. Load following customers, Bonneville does it for them. They've got a big pool of reserves, all the funding flows into there. Bonneville does the balancing. And so there's not as much need for EWEB to do it. And then that pooled risk and benefit at the bottom. I'll discuss this a little bit more on the next slide. But basically, right now, we have all of the risk and benefit of operating our resources in our load, right? So we can serve economically when it works, but we're also exposed on the other end when things are a little bit more expensive. So we directly see the revenues from our resources and our Bonneville product, as well as the cost to serve our load. With load following, Bonneville's kind of pooling those together and it flows through Bonneville's reserves. So if we think about that in the context with the market, and here we're just broadly talking about kind of the energy market. So up on the upper left, we're talking about planned products first. So there's Bonneville upper left and EWEB in the middle. So in this is like slice block, it's like what we have now. We're buying energy from Bonneville and we're using that energy to serve our load. And we're transacting with the market to balance. And so the revenues are flowing directly to EWEB, as is the cost. And so we see directly the market signals to move things, to optimize, to manage efficiently, right? We're seeing all those signals directly and we're making those decisions. For load following, now EWEB is on the lower left. And so Bonneville is kind of in the middle here. And so you pay Bonneville rates and you get energy from Bonneville, but Bonneville, for the majority of the portfolio, especially that federal side, they're the ones interacting with the market. So they're balancing the portfolio on our behalf. They're pooling the loads and resources, the cost to serve the load, the revenues are flowing to Bonneville's reserves. and then they flow to customers after that. So it changes our relationship with the market and how we do things. Every product's a little different, but this is a kind of a general way that they work that's different. And I just wanted to highlight kind of an example. I've got a little asterisk up the top here. These are all example numbers. These are not specific bondable rates. We could put real things, but it's not. Just trying to give a sense of the direction here. So on the left-hand side, we have kind of this quote unquote average market condition, Bonneville price versus the market. And you see Bonneville is the more orange line. Bonneville might change their rate designs in the future. They've tried to leave room for that. But in general, Bonneville rates are very stable. They set it and it's heavy and light load, very flat. They don't move. And so, if you're thinking about serving load, you could say, hey, that's great. I like the stability. I want the comfort of that. Or you could say, hey, I actually, I think that we do a really good job of optimizing our loads and resources. I want to invest in time of use rates and incentivize customers to help us nip the peak there and avoid those higher price times. Similar on the right-hand side here, those high market prices. This is showing another example. When you have a more scarcity event, maybe prices are a bit higher, you have a weather event. Right now, EWEB manages our resources to hit that. We can send the signal to loads and customers if we want. Bonneville, if you're on the load following side, you're going to get the consistent energy rate there. There's demand rates that make things more complicated, but this is the base idea being our current situation with the way that we manage block and slice provides for more dynamic responsiveness, right? This balancing loads and resources. Load following is a different construct. It's more stable. And maybe you don't need to invest in those things if you're just looking for that stability. So when we think about this in the context of programs and incentives, find that plan products tend to give us more options to implement those, right? So for load following, you're basically looking at Bonneville rates as your economic incentive to invest in things. Right now, we have those market prices that move. We can respond to those, as well as looking at when we need new resources, peaking resources or energy. That's what we're looking at as the kind of longer term avoided cost. So depending on our need and interest for developing programs, there's just different incentives the way that they work here. And I know that we've talked through this slide before. This is showing those 5 different products and kind of how much capacity, so basically how much peaking capability we would need across the products. And the goal for all of these is to get up to the orange dotted line. So all of the planned products are kind of the darker colors on the left. Load following is the lighter blue on the right. And the main message here is that for all of the planned products, there is a bigger need for resources than with load following. Those are typically, we're talking about more flexible peaking resources, could be physical resources, batteries, demand response. There's a variety of things that could fill this. But the main message here is that planned products, while they vary, they have more need. So when you think about, what is EWEB ready to invest in? What kinds of resources are we looking at? If we are thinking about local resource development as being something that we care about, planned products provide more of an incentive and opportunity because there are these gaps that we need to fill. And again, that market signal, those more dynamic signals from the market are kind of what you're going to see as the economic driver. Load following, your real incentive there is the Bonneville rate design. It's like, can you beat Bonneville's rates? Great. Otherwise, you might have some decisions around local resiliency or something like that that feed in. But again, that becomes more qualitative than an economic incentive. So just a brief summary here. So hopefully I've said planned products tend to have more flexibility, greater opportunities for local control. They have higher resource needs, but also that greater within your cost variability because we see, we take the benefits, we're optimizing our loads and resources, but there's also a risk to that sometimes. Load following, Bonneville's managing more of the portfolio. They kind of provide this buffer to the market, so we would get indirect signals. So we're really relying on Bonneville's rates, and Bonneville holds reserves. You basically pay Bonneville in your rates to hold these reserves to kind of flatten things out a bit for you. So as Ben had mentioned earlier, kind of this Bonneville product choice, while there's features of each product, it also creates this environment for future decision making, right? If you look at what EWEB needs to do to manage our portfolio, and you start thinking down the lines of like, well, do we want to develop resources? Do we want to manage portfolio and balance that ourselves, or let someone else do it? And how does that impact our flexibility in the future? So we can go back and answer questions. I'm sure there was a lot of material here that would be fun to talk about. Also, we're trying to just set up the discussion with a couple of prompts. So I would throw it to Brian or Frank about whether we want to start here or the board, but yeah, with this, just, you know, do you have a gut reaction to, you know, that local control? Does EWEB, do we tend to want to do it ourselves? Or are we okay? Hey, want to like take the reins, we're okay with giving up some local control.
So Aaron, could I add a 30-second color commentary on this before we hand it over for discussion? I want to give a example, not the one that you guys are worried about. On this slide, last summer, we had a high heat event at the same time that Karma was out. As you might recall, we have put out an ask to the customers to please to reduce usage if you can. Wholesale market prices were extreme, and it appears that they did reduce usage in a meaningful way. It provided not only a monetary benefit to EWEB, but also a benefit to the region. Now, our neighbors did not send out that message because they don't have that market exposure. BPA was out, BPA was exposed to the market, but certainly the subs and Lane Electrics of the world, they weren't worried about the market being $1,000 because that was sheltered from them, right? So just want to give a real example of, you know, this is what that market exposure means.
Sonia?
Okay, well, I have plenty of questions and thoughts on this one. So it seems like risk is higher and planned. We have more flexibility, but when we get flexibility, that it's not just flexibility for flexibility's sake. You want that flexibility to change your risk or deal with a shock or something like that. So when I look at the portfolio, I want to know what, you know, kind of shocks to the system that flexibility really deals with, and why we would see that as a benefit. And because, you know, when I look at this, it's like, okay, well, it's more stable. The pricing is more stable. It's less risky to do a model we're not doing now. And so it's interesting to see just what does flexibility buy us?
Let me talk for just a second on the risk part. I don't know that we would say that load following is less risky. I think we would say that instead of us managing the risk ourselves through our own risk management committee and our own reserves, we would instead be abdicating that to BPA. So they would be holding more reserves on our behalf when they have positive or negative interactions with the market. They'd essentially do cash calls on us or refunds if things go the right way. So there'd be this buffer of cash between us, but market operations are still market operations. On the flexibility side, Aaron, I may ask you to chime in on this one, but there are certain handcuffs that come with load following. Like if we wanted to bring a resource online, it has to play within EPA's somewhat prescriptive rules. I would describe it as a set of handcuffs. It is simply unpleasant from a regulatory standpoint to bring resources online within a load following contract. Aaron, maybe you can add a bit of color on that.
I don't want to get too far in the weeds on that, but yes, in general, load following has more restrictions on your owned assets and other contracts. They have just stricter requirements on bringing something specific to load. I think the other piece of flexibility, so, you know, when we talk about risk, there's one piece which is like within your hydro risk. And I think the other piece that we're trying to like puzzle out and we're still working through is like, there's long-term risk, right? So when you rely on Bonneville and like we look at the amount of regional load growth that there is, it's like, well, Bonneville says they're going to meet all of our peak demands. Like, are they actually going to do that? How much is it going to cost? And so to the extent that EWEB relies on Bonneville and Bonneville can't execute, are we able to go a different direction? There are a lot of very small customers who are wedded to Bonneville. They cannot do something else. So I think that when we think about flexibility, it's in that realm of, you know, one kind of the local control, but also like, is Bonneville like load following these other products? You are tied to 100 other customers who are also advocating for the same product, right? So it's a lot harder to get something unique to what you want. Also, you know, if there's something happens like Bonneville's acquiring a whole bunch of resources that can't do it, or it costs more than you want, do we have the capability ourselves to go develop something or implement a local program that can help us avoid those costs?
But I mean, it's a diversification of sorts. You talk about flexibility. I mean, when I think of portfolios, I think about investments. I think about, okay, how do you manage the risk of an investment portfolio? It's a similar concept. You have diversity in your portfolio. If you're putting all of your eggs in the BPA basket, then, you know, that's one concept, you know, kind of a more set it and forget it. Not that we would do that, but it's very different than having us have to manage the hourly rates and the contracts for each of those others, which does take a lot of time and expertise and skill, which is great that we have that, but will we always have that? I know we've had, you know, labor shortages and such too. So I'll let others ask questions, and I have other things to ask, but I'll leave it at that.
I'm gonna hand it over to Frank real quick. You had something to add.
Just a quick thing to add. I think that sometimes when we talk about flexibility, we're not just talking about resource flexibility, but decision flexibility. When you think about the unknowns of the future, making decisions that allow you to make future decisions more flexibly is part of how we consider flexibility. But relative to risk, I think one of the things that we're trying to understand is there are a lot of different forms of risk, and we'll talk about this a little bit in the second half. There's price risk, there's hydro risk, there's regulatory risk, there's load risk, you know, there's pricing risk, whether we're talking about being subject to the pool of Bonneville or our own management of resources. And there's really trade-offs between those. And I think we'll have to understand the value of flexibility in that context. And so I think ultimately, you know, when you think about this pooling, if we think we're positioning ourselves better than the pool, then we'll sort of lean toward this, I'm going to do it on my own. I'm going to be a DIYer if I think I'm better than the contractor. If we think there's advantages to the pool, then we may look at this and say, I want to lean into that pool a little bit more, even though there's pros and cons to both approaches, whether we do it or whether we push some of that off. Some of those are financial. We'll get into the economics because we're going to have, oh, this is going to lead to these futures. But part of this discussion is what's more important? Is it more important to be flexible? Is it more important to have local control? You know, there's pros and cons to doing it on your own versus leaning into somebody else. Bonneville raises a rate and we're tied to Bonneville. There's not a whole lot we can do about it. As opposed to actively manage resources, which has some of the opposite risks that I mentioned.
Thanks. Cindy?
Sorry if this sounds like a ridiculous question, but imagine there's a different federal government that makes a lot of decisions that don't necessarily make a lot of sense to many people. How much can something like BPA be changed?
That's
You mean
not a
this
ridiculous
actual
question.
Do you mean this actual federal agency that exists now?
Yeah, or yeah,
I mean, it's a process to change anything. I mean, people have talked about privatizing Bonneville's transmission, various things at times. The Bonneville's been created by federal statute. It's existed for a long time. It's hard to get things through. And they're independent financially from a lot of other, right? So they're, yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
Dream on. I was gonna, but, I was gonna. Okay, all right, there's a quote. I think in many ways, Bonneville can be subject to some of the same pressures that we feel, whether it's inside or outside the government. And some of the things that we're seeing, for example, is let's breach the lower Snake River dams and let's modify hydro operations, which further restrict the economic value in response to fish and wildlife needs. So there's, Bonneville is subject to some of those same pressures, even though they, in many cases, they aren't, their regulator is not FERC like in some of our hydro projects. They are also, that what complicates Bonneville in the relationship that they have with utilities in the Northwest is that they have really three very distinct functions that are combined into one organization. They are the marketer for the federal power system. So in primarily the dams and then some nuclear in there as well. So they market this power. They are also our balancing authority. And so they have a particular area of which they're responsible for ensuring that there's resource adequacy, the load is being met. So it's kind of a reliability function. And then third, they are a significant owner and operator of transmission. And so depending on which part of that you're talking about, they can be subject to pressures like a lot of other agencies are now, or even independent people are. I think really the thing that is common, no matter what, is we rely on the grid, and they're a significant part of the grid. And I think that's a reality independent of whether we lean into them for certain things or we do those on our own. There is a certain subjectivity, that we have for them. And I don't know if I answered the question, but they are under a lot of pressures, just like we are.
Well, and I just think hopefully this is just dystopian, but another administration came in that was a disruptive administration. I know you say that there's been talks years about these things happening, but like somebody could come in and pretty quickly change things. So to answer this question specifically, I am very much like all the participants at your table. I would like it both because it seems like it's a lot cheaper and easier for BPA to do it for us, right? It takes a lot of work off our plate. It's much simpler. We don't have to worry all about all of that. But I do really value the do-it-ourselves approach. Like you said, Brian, like we ask customers to reduce their energy usage during a high heat event. And I think that is really key in just looking at addressing the climate. Like we have to address behavior, and that's one of the ways to do it. And so I do really value that. I also value our climate goals. And I think if we're just completely tied to PPA, they might change their portfolio or where the resources come from. And we're kind of stuck with that. We can have these values, but we can't necessarily do much to live those values. So I would say that I'm maybe leaning a little bit more towards do it ourselves.
You forgot one other thing that BPA does.
What's that?
You forgot one other thing about BPA. They do irrigation as well. So part of their
And they
battery,
have an environmental foundation.
part of their battery goes to the Yakima Valley. We learned that on our little trip to Grand Coulee. For me, I think that we've kind of been setting up this utility to move towards local control. We have a highly dispatchable resource at Carmen that we can use when and where and to the best of our ability to realize the prices on it. We've spent a bunch of money on this new computer system so that we will be able to use demand response in the future. And as you alluded to, our community seems to be willing to buy into that type of interaction. I think so. Those three things make me lean towards that. I also feel that moving forward with the advancements in AI, it's going to be a game changer for trading power, because rather than having, you said part of it is you lose maybe some of the institutional knowledge of people that are upstairs trading power. But as AI moves into it, and you can put a lot more things in there, like, okay, there's a storm over Hawaii and it's going to be here, and you plug even more data into a picture and know when we want to turn Carmen up and when we want to turn Carmen down, I think is going to be very advantageous to us going forward. I look at it as, Sonia mentioned it's an investment, right? And to me, you can go in the bond market and have it be 3% straight, or we can go into equities and it could be 9% this year. And it could be, we could go down and have a bad year. But I think what we've seen is that that's just one part of it. That's just the financial part of it. But like Frank said, once you get locked in there, they're going to tell us when to turn Carmen on. And they're going to say, we need this power at this price for Carmen. And we could say, well, no, we've got Slice it. We've got Slice that you're selling to me for $10, and I can turn Carmen on and sell it for $25. And I think we have that ability now. And also, if we want to bring on other resources that we may not even know, in 8 years, the resources that are going to be out there may be wholly different than what we have available now and the price. So for me, I'm leaning towards block slice to get us close to what the regional requirements are going to be, and then move on from there, because we've had block slice for so long, we know that, but we have all these new tools that are coming on board that will help us enhance block slice.
Thanks. I have a couple questions, just clarifying the bar chart that you showed us earlier with the different products and the gap between what we would get, what we need to meet our load. So we're not just talking about the type of product that we're buying. We're talking about the amount at the same time, right? They're inherently linked. So I think it makes the conversation trickier, and without teasing that apart. I think you used the words, Aaron, whether we can beat BPA prices, right? I mean, that's kind of the bottom line is, are we able to keep our prices, with our ability, with our trading floor, we able to keep prices as good or better than BPAs? And so there's my question. How are we doing now? How are we done over the last 5 years? Are we at least not losing ground? I mean, my understanding is that our trading floor in many cases saves us as a utility money.
Yeah, so we did promise to not share numbers at this meeting.
I didn't ask for numbers.
But
I have the same question.
Just competition.
Yeah, we do think the trade floor does a nice job. Particularly with Carmen, we've got a lot of flexibility to go out and buy low and sell high. And they do a nice job of doing that, and really working tools that are at their disposal right now that would not be at the disposal of a load following customer.
Right.
So I have kind of an open-ended question I'd like to leave you all with. We got 5 more minutes and not exactly leaving, but to let you sit on it until December. We're going to be coming back with the quantitative analysis, which will show of what we think, opening costs would be under any of these contracts. Certainly if like a planned product comes back and it says, yeah, you can go out and do this cheaper as a BPA, and okay, let's do this cheaper. If load following comes back and it's cheaper, then we've got to value all domain, right? Like if it's, make up a number, $100,000 a year is the cost to go into a planned product. Okay, my freedom is probably worth the 100 grand. But if it's 10 million bucks a year, ooh, that's a different thing. Somewhere between those numbers, there is a point of indifference, and we need to decide if like they turn out to be golden handcuffs, how much are we willing to put out our hands, right?
Put it into question, Frank.
I think, Commissioner, we do a really good job of what we do today. I think our structure and our history has built to a certain point where we have our own resources, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the constraints going forward of the business model discussion. We do a good job of what we're managing today. I think we feel like that's the case. I don't think that's the question. I think the question is, for the next 17 to 20 years, depending on the life of the contract, what's going to give us the most opportunity, the most flexibility, the most resiliency from some of the issues that we see going forward. And I think that's, this isn't the case here, but you can be really good at doing the wrong thing. And that's not where we are now, but going forward, we need to be intentionally aligned around what's our strategy, where we think the opportunities are, how we're mitigating for some of the risks that we see coming, how we're mitigating or planning to mitigate for some of the risks we don't see coming. And so that's where the qualitative piece comes in, because eventually we're going to have this model and it's going to tell us, well, this one's going to cost us this and this is going to cost us that. We're going to look at it, but that's not a whole lot of difference under the ideal scenario. But what about sensitivities? What if the US government all of a sudden changes, according to Mindy, to something that we can't foresee right now? What does that mean for us? And so, it's the first time I didn't expect to hear AI tonight, but how we approach this is going to matter. But we do feel like we do a good job now, but really we need to be looking at this in a different time frame.
All right, good.
I want to channel my inner John Hart, who I'll wave at. I assume he's watching me. To something just about the portfolio management. So you asked, can we do it better than Bonneville? Referring specifically to demand rates, right? If Bonneville is your demand rate is your price signal, like, can you beat that with what is your cost to build a resource or do something? There's another piece, which is, it looks cheaper if Bonneville manages the portfolio. And part of that is just hidden costs, right? At the end of the day, someone is managing the portfolio, you're paying for that. We've interviewed a number of utilities. They have different structures for how they manage the portfolio. At the end of the day, you're paying somebody to do it. And so this is part of the local control piece is like EWEB staff, they do a good job. It gives us certain benefits, but you can pay someone else to do it. And just choosing a different product doesn't mean that you're not paying for it. It just changes the path the money goes.
So I have one comment and then a question that I'm going to leave on the table, and then I'm going to hand it over to Sonia because you have something else to say. I work for local government and I work with state and federal agencies. And I think overall that we are better at knowing what our local needs are and adapting to those locally than the larger agencies. They're good at some things, but I think we do it better locally. So from my perspective, I would push us more towards local control to the extent that we can. And then the other question, and maybe this is for later or your discussion in December, but I'm curious, what are the most consequential BPA policies? So we're talking about the price, right? The rates, and that's a fairly obvious one. But if we do the sensitivity analysis, what are the other BPA policies that really change things for us? Because, and then are those likely to happen, right? I mean, to the extent that we can forecast the policy risk coming from BPA, I think that'd be valuable.
So Aaron is the right person to answer this while he thinks of the correct answer. Can I ask if we have another hour, Frank?
I am not gonna try and answer that right now.
No, no need.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, coming back to
Uh,
that later would be great if you have thoughts
yes.
about it. And Sonia?
Okay, so just a couple last quick things. You know, Frank, when you were talking about, you know, the different risks that I mentioned before, and you listed off price, hydro, regulatory, mentioned talent risk. I mean, all of those things I think we see as potentially going up over time. It's not like any of those are down. So when you have more risk, you want more flexibility to handle that. Which is what I was getting at. Although when you look at the price curves and stability and some of those things, it looks like load feels very appealing. But given that we have other risk, but I am also curious, have you all looked at shocks to the systems from other organizations that have load following, or, you know, some of these more restrictive, and seen how BPA serves them? We know this, like, we know block slice, so it feels very safe, but I still have to go kind of outside of the box and push and ask for due diligence on what did they get or what didn't they get out of one of these other portfolios. And maybe you don't have the information now, but I think when we have these discussions future, like.
I mean, there's a whole bunch of different ways we could go. I think it's another one that's better to follow up on them rather than me try and.
Yeah, that's
like
fine.
a whole bunch of things.
And you know, when we say, okay, well, if BPA can't produce, that's one of the biggest risks. I mean, when we think about this, all eggs in one basket, if BPA can't produce, then the other question is, well, do we have the ability to buy those and set it up and make sure that we have that flexibility? And if we do, I mean, for me, I lean more towards diversification because we don't know what's coming. There's a lot of different pathways that we could go, the this end of the spectrum to this end of the spectrum. So for me, I think about those risks more. And then my last little piece that I wanted to, or actually two. So all of the portfolios you said, they all have the same environmental benefit, correct?
Yeah, I should say that the BPA fuel mix, the percentage of their system that is carbon free stays the same no matter which product you take. We don't think that it's particularly fair, but that is the reality of the situation.
So, so we couldn't buy a more clean or something. It's just, it is what it is.
Yes, the
Right,
BPA
so-
product is the BPA, or the BPA system mix is the BPA system mix no matter what. But what resources we go out to serve our needs, we control those in a planned product, or we would not with the load following contract. Just to put, I know I promised no numbers, but let me put some numbers out there. In the BPA white book, BPA is looking to be short in capacity in the next several years. We've of course talked about the regional load forecast and the trajectory it's on. BPA is looking to be short. This is peaking capacity, 370 megawatts beginning in 2027, up to a deficit of 2,700 megawatts by 2034. We have no idea where they're going to get that from.
And so if they go to some other, they could buy a natural gas peaking plant or nuclear or something else. They could go and buy that, and then we would just be stuck with that. So the environmental risk is actually there. It's higher. Because we don't have control over the resources that we pay with buy. They just fill that gap.
Depends on, yeah, so this is a complicated discussion too. So I would say at the starting point, we're talking about a tier one energy. All of the products, we get the same amount of energy from Bonneville, and that is this tier one, like 95% clean mix. If we think about capacity as purely meeting peaks, there's not a lot of energy necessarily to it. The energy decision, we kind of talked about this before. So our above high water mark, like load growth decision is going to be a separate decision on like where we get additional energy. So there's nuance to this as well. Bonneville's going to have different buckets of how they assign this. So I'm complicating it because it's at the starting point, all products kind of meet our broad goals of right. It's Bonneville's low cost, it's low carbon. And the question is where we move from there. And are we on a kind of Bonneville path in certain parts of it or not? And how much does EWEB own of that? it gets a little bit more squiggly when
Okay, so if we buy in,
buying,
all in,
buying load following, what is buying?
load following,
Okay.
all in on BPA, I'm trying to get the nuance of the various sides.
Yep.
It's tier one, so it's 95% clean, and they would guarantee that the energy that they're purchasing for us is 95% clean, but then they would do peaking with other things, or no.
The,
I
so
got two different
the
answers.
95,
So now
yeah,
I'm
so
confused.
Yeah, the 95% is today's system. So today's existing federal system is 95% covered.
Okay, but they're not guaranteeing anything out in the future.
No.
Okay, so there's environmental risk there as well for us. That's what I wanted to get at. Okay, thank you.
And let me also just say qualitatively, 2,700 megawatts is a lot. I have no idea where they're going to get 2,700 megawatts.
And Frank, you get the last word
Thanks.
and then dinner.
I appreciate the conversation. There are a number of different ways, and actually this tees up really well into the second half of the meeting. We talked about the unknown future and the fact that we have to be able to look at different scenarios and understand the impact of those scenarios. And when there's a lot of unknowns, flexibility is one of the ways that you can mitigate for that. The other way, which is the whole dilemma here, is that you can pool your risk as well. And so there are some advantages to, you see a certain stability, for example, with a more of a full requirements leaning into Bonneville, because they are pooling their risks, which has certain advantages. The flip side of that is that it may expose other risks. And so it really isn't a matter that risk goes away. It's how and where we manage that and how we sort of balance that with the potential upside of things that we think we could do better versus what we think Bonneville could do. And that's really the basis for why we want to look at this qualitatively. And it's been helpful to hear commissioners express a certain sort of leaning toward the fact that we think we have a certain local response, a local obligation. We'll talk a little bit about Commissioner Borowski. You talked about how we've set ourselves up to be a certain way. That's absolutely correct. In fact, if you look at our strategy, it is all around the present business model. And so we'll talk about that and some of the constraints relative to these. What do we do versus what Bonneville might do, and how we manage that, after whatever is next, I guess eating. But the qualitative piece is important to just start getting these trade-offs out there, because a lot like the discussion, we can't have everything. We're going to have to lean in and say, under certain scenarios, we see certain benefits and others we don't. How are we going to manage that? So a lot of ways to manage this risk.
Right. Thanks. And with that, we'll take a recess to grab dinner. We'll be back in 15 minutes. back for the October 15th work session of Eugene Water and Electric Board. And we're going into the next agenda item, the electric business model perspectives.
President McCray, thank you. Good evening again, commissioners. For the record, Frank Lawson, CEO and General Manager. The second half of the work session this evening is to really broaden the conversation from BPA expanding outward to EWEB's larger electric business model. This evening, we'll look at understanding the present model, some of the constraints and how that model was originally developed and why, look at some future options, eventually drilling down to what we think some of those decisions would ultimately become and the trade-offs between those. And then we'd like to finish with kind of continuing the discussion we had around Bonneville, but again, trying to understand commissioners' perspectives on how you would see managing risks and trade-offs when it comes to a broader business model. So what we mean by a business model, and when we talk about vertical integration, we're really referring to the links between sort of the commodity, which in this case is electricity, how that gets produced, generated, how it gets ultimately marketed, balanced, and delivered to our retail customers. And so, you know, you can see, and these are relatively scaled to size, although some of them were made a little bit larger so you could actually see them. But you can see presently our portfolio as an organization includes Bonneville, of course, which is a large chunk, and it's a federal resource that we have access to. And right now it's as you know, split between a block of energy and then a slice of the federal system, which is variable by water. We have some of our owned resources. These have been developed and procured over the last century. We also, there's one of the wind farms, by the way, with a 50% owner. And so not all that would sort of be split between contract. And then we have some direct contracts, and then we lean into the commodities market. And so we have relationships and resources spread throughout those different types of generation. And then as you can see, kind of when you move toward the middle of the model, we have a wholesale function, a wholesale part of our business, which interacts with our retail demand and also with other trading partners that we either buy and sell electricity to or from, and based on the particular need at the time. Sure.
The little color on this one, first of all, Aaron Bush put this together. We have yet to find anything he's bad at. I assume he has some horrible secret we don't know about. We agonize quite a bit over the detail on this one. Every little line has a story behind it. Just to give you an example, yellow line from the wholesale market, the international paper is reflective of the way their contract works. Get a chunk of power and yet they maintain a load exposure to the market, so they ship their load around the market. Supply surplus, for example, that goes to the wholesale market because it's surplus and what we have. So every little bit of this has a lot of thought that went into it. If you want to dive into the details, I know some nerds that love to talk shop.
Nerdy details aside, thanks, Brian. Every line does matter on here. Also wanted to give you a little bit of an indication why and how this got to where it is, and what some of the restrictions are. First of all, there's a lot of things that we're considering and have considered through time as this particular portfolio was put together. Obviously, the regulatory environment, the Northwest Power Act, the Federal Power Act, again, this developed over basically a century of the evolution of those. There is also this notion of federal access, and I wanted to use an example that kind of comes in. You look at Bonneville, and that's one of the questions. Well, why can't we just rely on Bonneville for everything? And part of that is we can't. When we have our own resources, Bonneville's obligation is a net requirement. And so one of the items on here you'll see under contract is what's called Smith replacement. That is not Carmen Smith, that is actually Smith Creek, which is a resource that we used to own. We sold that resource, but we still are still obligated to procure the energy that even though we sold off our ownership of that particular hydro operation in northern Idaho. And so the federal system and access to that is on a net basis. And so a little bit of difference in the Leberg example. There are requirements. So all of these in green are ones that are basically resources that are dedicated to load. And so Bonneville's net requirement is based on those. In the case of Leberg, it met certain requirements that Bonneville was able to reduce that and replace it. Had to do with uneconomics, end of life, some of these other criteria. But if we were to just sell off an asset to somebody, it would not mean one of the green ones, I'll be specific. If we were to sell off one of the green assets, we would be obligated to replace that energy through contract. That would not go to Bonneville as a tier 1 requirement to replace. We could lean in on a tier 2 basis. Tier 2 is basically they're going to market for it. So it's an indirect way of establishing a contract. So there's limits to sort of how we got here and why BPA is the percentage that they are, and why some of the history of our own development of assets is why there is a mix here. And so why you see the combination of owned, BPA, contract, and then market. So there's some ground rules associated with that, including how we manage the risk here through the risk management committee, financial reserves, and a number of other board policies as well. So there's kind of 3 ways to look at the business model. We can change the business model in potentially sort of 3 primary ways. One of them is we could look at the generating mix, and I talked about it. There are obvious, and we'll get into this a little bit more. There's trade-offs between owning a resource, procuring a resource through contract. We'll talk a little bit about that. So I categorize these as sort of the resource mix. We can also look at another business model change, which might be the resource management. This would be where we look at, you see sort of the number 2 there, which is how we manage or balance our system. Presently through a trading floor, we have a number of partners. It's a bilateral market. I think, as you know, we call up people and we trade energy back and forth on various periods, whether a month ahead, sometimes we hedge years ahead. We have day ahead markets or customers in this case, real-time markets. So we are managing the imbalances in our system to try to optimize that so that we don't actually get charged by our balancing authority for being out of balance, which is Bonneville. The third, and I kind of put limited here, I didn't even put a number by it. I don't know that we're actually in a position to change our service territory dramatically. I mean, you could say that's a potential business model change. We are chartered by the city of Eugene. I don't think that's going to be something that we change dramatically, potentially with the exception of how far outside of the city of Eugene and outside of that charter do we really want to make changes to relative to our retail customers. So the retail piece is probably relatively fixed, but we can look at the generating mix and also the management of that. They're kind of, again, in these number 1 and number 2, resource mix and resource management. The resource mix decision really comes down to ownership versus contract. There are trade-offs between those. We'll talk a little bit about it. We are mostly contract, but we are diverse. We do have our own resources. And so thus the X there between the own and contract is sort of leaning toward the contract side. If you consider a kind of BPA also as a contract, which is contractually an obligation and an obligation to fulfill on their part. You can also look at how you operate those. There is a difference between owning a resource and operating it. I don't know that we'll get into that distinction this evening. The other part of that is really the resource management. That's going to be really a choice between how active we want to be in the resource management side of it versus how responsive, which is are you going to lean into somebody else and then adjust your resource management to respond to the needs of the market or the market signals that you may be getting. And so there's kind of an active versus inactive, I would say active versus passing, direct versus indirect. Won't go into all of these details, but I think that you've gotten a flavor over the last number of years. All of you've been on the board for a number of years. There are risks and rewards to owning a generating facility. You're dealing with operational flexibility, which is a very positive thing. There is local control. We've talked about some of those things. We're very hydrocentric, and so our impact on the watershed, for example, in the Mackenzie River, is something that we value and we cherish. There's also a very difficult to navigate regulatory construct, and so there's water availability, for example, is a vulnerability that you have when you own a resource, and so there's trade-offs with owned versus contract. Contract, you're dealing in some ways with lower entry costs. You may also be dealing with higher marginal costs or higher variable costs. There are contract obligations, whether that's by period or by price. We've seen through history, we've had some contracts that we thought were in the money to begin with, became out of the money as the contract went along. So there are pros and cons to contracting resources as well. There's also, you're now party dependent. And so you're dealing not just with something that you can control and you can optimize, but now you're dealing with something that someone else is responsible for the maintenance and the operation, and then you have to deal with that variability. So there's kind of pros and cons to that resource mix, owned versus contract construct going forward. We've already talked about this a little bit relative to resource management. Talked on, in the first conversation, if we are managing our own balancing, then, we have this ability to tailor that to our own resource mix. I think it was mentioned, we can actually sell on the market when the market is at a premium. We can hold back and adjust resources. Carmen Smith, I think, was mentioned in the first conversation, in the sense that it can peak during certain times and then sort of ebb and flow, and you can align that to try to leverage the fact that you can have sort of pricing arbitrage. And it's like stocks. You want to sell when they're high and you want to buy when they're low. I think it's the same thing on a much more dynamic. Well, I shouldn't say much more. The stock market's been pretty dynamic lately, but some of the similar concepts, and you can do that when you're in the active management role. If you're in a role where someone else is actively managing that, then you're really responding to their price signals. Some of that dilutes, for example, some of the value that we could potentially get out of the load side management. I thought it was really appropriate that it was mentioned in the first conversation, the alignment between our resources and the fact that our strategy really talks about this synchronizing between supply and demand, and the fact that there is value on the resource side if we can adjust the demand side to be able to optimize that. If you're leaning into someone else, into a pool, you are now diluting, you are now having to change the value that you had with your direct control into something that's now under someone else's control. There still may be value in moving things around, but it's not as directly controllable. So the utility of the future, I mean, there's a number of different ways to look at that. And again, you could draw circles around this and you could kind of say, well, we've set ourselves up to really be and continue to be this vertically aligned utility, which means we want to still play a very active role in the ownership and the management and the contracting of the resources, as well as the management of those resources through the balance of wholesale and retail. And then in all of that with really the benefit of trying to add as much value to our customers, our retail customers. You could also say, let's really focus on resources and sort of delivery. We'll let the management of some of that, we'll contract through that, we'll lean into somebody else. That would be another business model. And again, there's kind of pros and cons to that, as we've talked about. You could also say, let's divest of resources. Let's just treat resources as this commodity, and our job will be the management and delivery of that commodity in the most optimal way. And so there are, what you do when you are in that situation, you are divesting some of the risk and variability that comes with owning and managing your own stock portfolio, for example. You know, I'm going to decide which stocks I'm going to buy versus I might buy a mutual fund instead, which is, you know, you may have less upside, but you also may have leveraged the diversity of that portfolio differently. And so there are different ways to go here. I will point out the transition or migration to any of these is years. This isn't necessarily something that we would say, let's transition to this immediately. Some of the key timeframes around that, and we're talking about the Bonneville contract being 17 years, it is likely that there will be some sort of midterm check-in on that contract that might provide the ability to flex in a different direction. We also, in the early 2030s, roughly, will have decisions around some relicensing decisions associated with that time. So much of this is not, I mean, you can set up decisions to create the flexibility to look at business models. That's one of the aspects of flexibility. But we also know this isn't something that we would necessarily turn on a dime. It took us 100 years to get to this point. And if we want to go another direction, we will need to do that intentionally and carefully. I already did that one. So a couple of quick key questions for commissioners to consider and really hopefully inspire some conversation here. You know, one of them is we do, you know, this is a question that we're asking ourselves, this very first one, you know, how does a BPA product choice impact the future business model options? I think that's something that we are really trying to consider when we bring back a recommendation to the board. It's going to be, yes, there's going to be economics, there's going to be social, environmental impacts, local control, flexibility, risk with different scenarios. You know, what happens if load grows or at a greater rate or not a greater rate? Those are all things that we consider, but also very directly, what gives us flexibility relative to business models? Beyond that decision, what are the qualitative aspects that commissioners would tend to prioritize relative to future? And we know that there's the values. We're not going to let you off the hook. Like the community table, you know, what are the things that you see as most important? If that's local control, the good, the bad, and the ugly of that, okay, we'll own that. Is it something related to the fact that we can, over time, have the ability to choose these? And to your point, President McCray, we probably have a better feel for our local community than, say, if we were to outsource or diversify that. Why might you see more or less risk with local control versus regional control? There are pros and cons to that. You know, the mutual fund is a good example. There are ways to mitigate it by pooling your risks. There are also ways that which you can maybe manage those directly. And so I'd like to get your take on that. We also kind of want to, we want to understand your bias here, in the sense that how important is it, for example, that we happen to be the ones who own the generating resource on our water supply? We could, if we sold those, we didn't own those, someone else would still be subject to many of the same FERC water management requirements that we have. How important is that? That we have a dual stacking of interests on the McKenzie River specifically. What criteria might be important in deciding who and where the business model functions reside? Again, that's kind of goes back to where we see the pros and cons of that. And then one of the things that we really want to try to understand is that what are the key pieces that you think we should be investigating going forward that could help this board, potentially future boards, evaluate these business models? Maybe more specifically, we have a few things that we already know that we need to take a look at relative to pro forma statements of certain functions and the way that we operate. And what I mean by that is how do you characterize the value of a specific resource versus the portfolio? But if there's other things relative to that, it'd be important to know. If you think about our strategy, and I'll just kind of end it this way, we've talked about the strategy being really the fact that the dynamics on the resource side and the consumption side are both becoming more dynamic. You're seeing it in price curves, you're seeing it in the way consumption works. Our approach, our strategy has been, and we talked about this even with rate design, is to influence behavior that creates value for our customers long term. Some of that value comes in the optimization of these resources. If we then decide not to manage those resources, our strategy will need to reflect that. And so the fact that we're going to be talking a lot about strategy over the next year to kind of refresh that is also related to this. So with that, President McCray, I'll pass it back to you and sort of look forward to understanding the trade-offs as the commissioners see it, what you prioritize, what questions you have, and what you might want to know further and more about.
Oh, yeah, 15 minutes left on our agenda tonight. If you all want to spend that time, we can talk about it when we get to 7 o'clock. Okay. And we'll start with John Brown. Oh, John didn't have anything to say, so. Brodsky?
Sure. I'm going to first pose a question to you. If you had to start this utility today, which direction would you go?
That it's an interesting question. Part of which I think where we are today matters. So I don't know that I would be able to answer that today. Part of the answer there too is that it did take us a long time to get here. And as much as I'd like to be able to wipe the slate clean, I don't know that that's actually a fair thing to do based on where we are.
Right. And the reason I asked that was because, when we started 100 years ago, it was like we needed to build a dam so that we could have power for the city of Eugene.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the option. We didn't have an option of calling Bonneville and saying, can you turn our lights on for us? So for me, the risk and reward I break it down to almost entrepreneurship as opposed to working for something. Right? If I'm an entrepreneur, I have the opportunity to have larger gains, larger successes, but I have a bigger chance of failure rather than if I go to work for somebody and punch a time clock and know that I'm going to get paid for my 40 hours a week. And so that's kind of what I see an equation to here. And instead of an entrepreneur going bankrupt, if I make the wrong choices, the impacts are I'm going to have to raise prices on my customers that we have to supply. So but the rewards can be much greater in the entrepreneurial system. And what that means is that we have a greater opportunity to keep those prices lower if we do our job correctly. And we don't have to pass it on. I feel that this organization has done a really good job of that in the past. And I think we can continue doing that going forward. The risks that really scare me are the regulatory ones. That's what we hear about four or five times a year. We hear about the regulatory environment and how those are going to impact the entrepreneurial thing, our profitability. And so being able to detach ourselves from regulatory burdens of owning a dam are intriguing to me. But then you also lose the entrepreneurial incentive of owning that dam. So I still lean towards the business model we have going forward, and utilizing that. And then we start procuring more resources, lean into the ones that have the less regulatory requirements with them. So rather than buying into more hydro dams, if somebody says, I'm going to build a dam, stay away from that. But if they're saying, hey, I've got a new technology, whether that's batteries, hydrogen, even, I'm going to say it, you could probably put this in your book too, small nuclear, those types of things, that would have a little bit more regulatory. That's where I'm leaning.
Thank you, Commissioner.
Mindy?
I feel like if we went the direction where, the opposite direction of where we are today, then really we're just pass through kind of, right? And so our values don't really matter anymore because we're just like a middle. So I think if values are important to us at all, then that would kind of negate the decision to go that direction. I feel like kind of what John said, definitely what John said. One of EWEB's strengths is that we've been able to pivot in times when we needed to pivot. We've been creative in the way we've thought about things. And part of that has to do probably with our size. And part of it has to do with what Matt touched upon before, is that we really know what our local needs are. And I think that that is a huge strength that needs to be taken into consideration. I think that if we go straight with BPA or we lock ourselves into being stuck with a decision, it just gets really clunky. Like you can't really change things very quickly, or you can't be responsive. And when I think about the future, there's so many unknown variables on multiple levels. And it seems like being able to be quick on your feet and nimble and responsive is a really important attribute to have. So I know that also there is risk there, because if something happens to one of our assets and we need power and we don't have a way to get it, that's also risk. But I just think given our size, like kind of being fast on our feet is a value. And so I also like the direction that we going.
One of the things that probably didn't mention is that if we're not vertically integrated within, in this case, a single commodity, what kind of other business model does that create? And another way to look at that would be kind of this trade-off between focus and scale. And if we weren't vertically integrated, if we weren't putting not just the money, but sort of the opportunity cost, the brain cells into managing this entire string of electricity, there is the potential that we could leverage and expand the relationships with our customers. And some of the things that come to mind are the fact that we have connectivity into every single premise in the city of Eugene. What else could we leverage that for? whether that's communications, whether that's maybe owning appliances and selling them, you know, instead of selling electricity, you're selling heat or air conditioning. I mean, you can integrate the other direction. The way we are now is we're, you know, focused on being good at that. And the more we could focus on being good at something else, but we would give that up. So there are pros and cons to, I think the primary business premise of this is whatever you do, you want to be really good at it. And the more you sort of expand and dilute yourself, the less chances you are of being really good at that. And so that's where, because someone's going to ask, well, why can't you do that anyway? Why? Because, well, at some point you become fragmented. And right now we are focused on this vertical integration, and that's where we are. And that's where I see the focus. Two risks that I see, Commissioner Borowski. One is probably two or three of the biggest ones. Regulatory risk is one when you own it. The other one is a scarcity risk. The fact that if you look across the Northwest, where are we going to get market liquidity as this area grows? And, you know, can you just go out and contract things? Maybe, maybe not. Markets are going to change. There's going to be a different supply demand curve. There might be some value to leaning into something that would spread that risk more. I mean, these are things we're going to have to test. So.
One clarifying question. So looking at the two charts, there's the pie chart of our power supply that had like 70% BPA and 30% of other things. But then on the
There was own and contracted.
yeah,
Sorry, I'm having to go backwards.
there's one. Cool. Yeah, so 72%, isn't that far off. And then, right, a whole bunch of things that we own and contract. Is that the average over the course of the year? What does that represent there?
This particular one was megawatt average megawatts produced. It wasn't nameplate. It was what's produced on average.
Okay. And then if we go back to the kind of spaghetti diagram that Aaron made, it looks like the BPA contribution looks smaller than that, right? The block and slice of BPA there. So how are those different, or is it just different charts and
Different charts. Some of these we had to scale them so you could read them.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, that's
and that was mentioned earlier. So I was just making sure that okay.
yeah. And there's also, you know, there's so many ways to slice and dice this, Commissioner. If you go by nameplate, you're going to get a different mix. If you go by capacity contribution, you're going to get a different mix.
Sure.
The pie chart was average, but one of you look at all these, and summer capacity is different than winter capacity. I mean, you really, the characteristics of the resource start to be important.
Yeah. Yeah, understood. And I was just trying to make sure I was understanding that right.
Yeah, and this doesn't include the sort of commodities part, which is sort of the buying and selling of the market chunk that we use. This is more of the planned resources on a planning basis. So it's a little bit different.
Yeah, so I guess what I want to point out here with this chart, or 75 or 72% is kind of the same. Like, we are relying heavily on BPA already. And a couple of the I think it's clear we talk a lot about resilience here, about curveballs in our future, many of them. And when we think about resilience principles, diversity and redundancy are right at the top, right? Maintaining diversity and maintaining redundancy. And so I think to the extent that we're not relying more on BPA than we already are, it enables us to have a more diverse portfolio than we would if we're just leaning on BPA, recognizing BPA is going to have its own mix, but we're going to be buying a piece of that either way, right? So all things being equal, my sense is that we have a few more options available to us if we don't invest more in BPA than we already are. And then on the redundancy side, we were talking about the trading floor, right? BPA's got their trading floor, and then we have our trading floor. But that might be really helpful as we look at curveballs. So I just to put those two principles there, I think maintaining, not increasing further our dependency on BPA, from my perspective, will help us manage curveballs, recognizing that there is risk of local ownership and operation. We're eating it with Lieberg,
Mm.
right? I mean, and some of that is the regulatory risk that has smacked us upside the head, but that's a part of local ownership, right? So there's plenty of risk there. And also, it feels like we're managing that. And that felt like, that feels really big. And so one of the things to investigate is, are there bigger local ownership risks that we're not thinking about? So some of the ones that have bitten us in the past, the Seneca contract, right? Lieberg and Walterville are, and even Carmen Smith, right? We're running into things where we have costs there that we're trying to figure out how we manage. Are there other bigger local ownership risks that aren't yet in our conversation? Because to me, that would be helpful for us to think about. And I'm quite confident that if we're looking at purchase of future resources, we're not going to duplicate what happened with Seneca, right? There's enough memory in the institution, right? And when we think about local ownership of new resources, you know, Borowski's like, don't buy small hydro. I mean, we'll be thinking really hard, long and hard before we do that again. So I just think we've learned a lot. We've got a really well experienced and bright team. And I think, yeah, so I just want to reiterate my inclination that we don't rely more on BPA than we already are. The other thing I wanted to ask about is the conservation opportunity. My observation, and I'm looking for you to correct me if I'm wrong, is that we EWEB are more able to leverage conservation in our territory than our peers, our neighboring locally owned utilities that are primarily just distributing EPA power. Is that a fact? Is that a function of the way we operate in our ownership, or is it just a function of the interest of those boards?
Jump, you wanted to respond, but I'll add on.
There's some nuance on the BPA contract side that I do think influences it. That said, I'm of the opinion that the bigger driver is a local values decision on that.
Yeah.
EWEB has committed to serve our load growth with energy efficiency. We were able to do so for 15 years. Yeah. We've got the size to hit the economies of scale to have energy efficiency staff that can go out and execute that. You know, again, there's some nuance on the BPA contract side that does influence that, but I think the big driver is we've got the size and willpower to go out and do it.
Well, from my perspective, the demand response and the conservation potential are really significant pieces of slices of the pie that we aren't really talking about, but they're there, right? That we have potential to execute on, that we might have less potential to execute on if we just turn it all over to BPA to drive the procurement bus. So those are a couple of things that I think we should research. I know we're already doing it, conservation potential, and then I'll give it to you. Conservation and DR potential and price sensitivity, right? We've talked some about that, like how much can we really expect to get in terms of response potential?
You touched on one thing, Commissioner, that I know that we have to keep in the forefront of our thinking. When we think about contracts, we almost always go to the economic value of contracts. The contracts also have a stacking of benefits as well. You know, do they facilitate, for example, conservation or even the alignment with our strategic work around demand response and peak mitigation and some of these things? Not only does that have an economic value under a contract, it can also have environmental value. It can have customer value from a relationship perspective. There's all kinds of sort of a stacking of benefits that we can get. I would say that just on the conservation question that you had, there's a little bit of construct there as far as the value of it. But EWEB made a conscious choice to invest in it is really the driver. We developed the capabilities, the engineering capability to support it. And therefore, and we pay for it through Bonneville, but we typically do more than what we get reimbursed for. So that was a conscious choice that goes back actually several decades, that
then got sort of codified in the fact that we were going to use that as a growth mitigation tool as well.
Well, and to add to that, right, that every time we do invest in conservation, especially when it comes to homes, you know, that get weatherized, we reduce the exposure of those families to extreme temperatures, right? If we have a power outage, they can last longer comfortably in their home if it's weatherized. Like there's a whole bunch of resilience benefit too to that conservation that may or may not have been our driver, but it seems to me as we're thinking about where we're going over the next 10 years is a huge piece of it, right? To the extent that we were having higher temperatures and we can buffer that by increasing the number of homes that are really well insulated. To the extent that we have that tool and we can lean in with, it feels like it's a huge opportunity that we could give up if we lean in more to BPA. I'm gonna stop because one of these times or Sonia, we're actually already over time. So can we just set
Sorry, Sonia.
take a thermometer? No. Take a thermometer for how much appetite we have for. It's 5 after. We want to go to quarter after. 10 minutes left.
To your point about kind of the ability to do more conservation, I mean, that gets back to what you all were talking about earlier about, you know, when we had the big heat wave and we asked our customers to mitigate their usage. I mean, we have an incentive to, because we have some skin in the game. They don't as much if they are a part of that pooled situation. So they don't have it seems to me they don't have that same kind of connect, which is part of our values. We do care about reducing our impact. And you know, if we go out on the market, then that's a purchase that's probably from a natural gas peaking plant. So just wanted to weigh in on that, so I agree. Thank you. When I think about the other, like our values and how we weigh those, you know, when I think about safe, that has to be the top of the line. And I think a lot of our safe work comes from a regulatory perspective. The drivers of that are constantly the rules and the regulations driving that forward. Now I'm sure, go above and beyond, but the, you know, litigious nature of our culture is such that the regulations and, you know, that risk kind of drive that. And that's a here situation and that's in a future situation, but that one just is always going to be there and be at the top of the list for me. Then when we start thinking about kind of affordability, reliability, and environment, we start thinking about kind of that timeline for how those risks hit. So affordability is here and now. Our people are feeling it. We have the risk because we have to vote to raise prices or not, and how we handle that. That's here and now at all times. It impacts our customers immediately. When I think about reliability, and partly because we've done such a great job, and also because there are rules and regulations that help make us a very stable organization, we only have the reliability concerns, I think, when there's a shock to the system, instead of constant reliability challenges, right? So I think of that as there's a potential risk out there, and there's a cost associated with that potential risk. And so when I think about the mitigation of that risk and balancing it, I would say, okay, well, if that risk costs $100 or $100,000, then we also have to think of the chance of hitting that risk, and whatever that chance times the risk is the amount that we should pay to mitigate that risk. But that's a harder figure to pull at, and it's in the future. And then, you know, when we think about kind of the environmental and the community side of it, again, that when I think about the environmental side of it in the portfolio, it's really about what's the greenhouse gas emissions. You know, we'll set some of the other values aside there, because I think, you know, we have environmental risk of, you know, Carmen and the sinkholes that we have, but that's not the kind of environmental risk that I think of when I think of what we're trying to mitigate with our portfolio. I think that's more of a safety risk, a reliability risk. When I think of environment in terms of this, I think of how is our portfolio making sure that we are doing our part to keep the community, solid in the future in the face of climate change. And so that one is, and I think just naturally, because we always push that down the road, it's not here and now, it's easier to push off, and everybody's doing that. And that's why we're not dealing with it collectively as much as we should be. So it's just interesting to look at those kind of different time horizons and the kind of the chance of the risk versus the cost of the chance of that particular risk. To think about how we set up a portfolio that is as affordable as we can be, but then, not overdo it on these other sides. And so that's how I think about it when you're asking about the values and how we weigh them. That's what comes to mind for me.
Yep, thank you. I mean, there certainly, you touched on a lot of the things, Commissioner Carlson, that I think in some ways create some even tensions, because you're talking about the magnitude, the likelihood, the timing of which those risks can occur. And we have to balance that with the fact that, going back to the entrepreneurial analogy, and if I were to start the utility today, I wouldn't be starting with a base load of 300 megawatts, of which we're obligated to serve. But you would take into account the fact that investments today have a longer impact. And so how would you start to weigh the immediacy of your decisions versus positioning the utility for the best thing long term? And I think that that's sort of the difference between the marginal cost and the invested cost, or the amortized cost, right? There's a lot of trade-offs. What I'm hearing is how you sort of weigh those values, which is helpful. I'm also hearing from this group kind of the importance of being nimble, flexible, looking at the fact that when we control it ourselves, there's maybe larger upside to that, as long as we can find ways to mitigate and handle the risks associated with that upside, right? And those risks do manifest themselves in pricing, affordability, sometimes even reliability. We want to make sure that we're doing this so that we can actually make changes to our distribution system as well. And we have an aging distribution system. If you're going to go unlimited load everywhere, you're going to create those reliability problems that you've been talking about. And so it seems like the board is comfortable with kind of the alignment around these decisions and business models that align with the present strategy that we have, which is create this flexibility, look at mitigating and balancing the load and the supply side in a way that optimizes it. It doesn't mean it's perfect. It's trying to optimize those decisions. And it sounds like that's kind of been reinforced, obviously knowing that there's trade-offs, and when Brian shows you a bunch of numbers, you're going to pick your favorite, and we're going to have to sort of recalculate this whole thing. But that's what I'm hearing. The value of diversity, redundancy, to your point, nimbleness, flexibility, upside, those lend themselves toward more of a DIY utility, as opposed to we're gonna in some ways be subject. We already are somewhat subject to the grid, certainly, but to be more subject to the grid is probably not in our long-term best interest. If my summarization is accurate there.
Any last comments from commissioners? I think you got it right.
John Brown might have it totally different.
But he's not in the room, so we'll never know.
I'm sure I will hear from John Brown shortly after he listens to this. But this was helpful. I hope it was informative to commissioners, and some of these things we will continue, and hopefully you'll see and you'll look for in some of the things that we bring back for consideration, that we're trying to navigate the values and all of the values and the sort of the pros and cons from a business perspective. And, appreciate Brian and his team for trying to keep us out of the numbers, even though it's complex, but appreciate your thoughts.
I just want to comment on the effectiveness of this type of a meeting. Without a timer going and a 30-second clock in front of us, and we're back and forth. It's something that I think works well, at least for me. So I just want to thank you for allowing us to do this. And if there's other complex issues in the future, I would be able to these types of.
This is the last one. We'll never have another complex issue ever.
You can put that in your book too.
Yeah. Well, definitely, President McCray, if you don't mind, just thank commissioners for taking some extra time to meet and discuss this complex issue, the one of what will be many, Commissioner. So we're not done with this, and any kind of feedback during our one-on-ones on the format, appreciate it.
Thanks. Being adjourned.